background. I do come from a sheep background. My dad and I guess we in my family, we have a little family farm. We raised sheep. We had some cattle at a time. We had pigs at a time. But my main thing was sheep. I showed sheep 4-H. As part of 4-H, I showed cattle with 4-H. So I've been through that whole gamut. But I am really excited to be here. So thank you for having me. And Tom, I'll let you go ahead and you can introduce yourself.
Sure, they already know folks. You. That's fine. Well, and now the folks heard me last week. A little different topic this week, but we really are flattered that you've joined us. And just a reminder, we're coming from the Mid-Atlantic of the East Coast of the United States. We really are flattered. So many people from different states, different regions have joined us. But and throughout this presentation, we'll remind you that much of what we share is from the perspective and viewpoint of the Mid-Atlantic, but we're hopeful that you're going to take away some useful information tonight, no matter where you're located.
All right, thank you, Tom. So with Tom saying that, you will hear it'll be repetitive. I think a lot of this will kind of be repetitive. A lot of it can be used for all sheep of all natures, if you will, different areas. It really applies to all sheep. We'll start this presentation off by this quote from Lawrence and Dyer about understanding behavior. So this is just talking about animals' natural behavior, how we want to, I guess, enhance or show off that behavior. So a lot of that's going to be derived from genetics. Some of it's going to be from environment, and then their association with each other through lambing, through weaning, all the different life stages that occurs. And if I go too fast, please slow me down. I really talk fast, I'm so sorry. But this is a little outline. So we are going to start about how small ruminants behave. So this is goats, this is sheep. A lot of this stuff is kind of gonna relate also to cattle in some instances. And when that is, I'll be sure to tell you that or let you know. Then we'll talk about why we need to handle small ruminants. So why do we run it through a chute? Why do we need to do that? Then we'll talk about fencing, we'll do some restraints, and then we'll finish up with housing. So I didn't mention this before, but I actually have a graduate degree in animal behavior. So I studied some of this stuff or this information through grad school. And I did a Kayleigh gate study as my dissertation, if you will. Not really, but kind of the same thing. So anyway, this is how the commonalities between both sheep and goats. So they're both hoofed animals. We all know that, right? They're both ruminants. I think we all kind of know that too. So they have one stomach that has 4 compartments. The biggest one of that being the rumen that we're trying to feed all the time. So that's why they eat grass all the time, to feed the microbiome in the rumen. As far as vision goes, they have horizontal pupils. So this allows them to see unlimited peripheral vision. So it's said that when they have their head down for grazing, they really can see all around them. But when they have their head up, there's a blind spot in the back and right in front of their noses. They do see in color. So I have in my notes here that they see cyan, green, blue, orange, a little bit of red, your purples, greens, and things of that nature. They also have excellent hearing. So loud noises really don't work well with sheep. They're going to remember the negative things when you work with them. They're going to remember negative more so than positive. So always try to have a positive demeanor around them, be calm, don't be loud. They're not fans of that. I don't know who is. Okay, so this is not necessarily just sheep and goats. So all animals have this behavior, or these behaviors, all 9 of them. So first we'll talk about agnostic behavior, and that's going to be the combative behavior. So we see this more so in males. So in rams, they're going to ram each other or ram you. So you need to be careful about that. And then in goats, they'll rear up and I don't know if it's called bunking you, but they'll rear up and ram you again there as well. Ewes or does, on the other hand, they're not as aggressive, but they can be aggressive, especially during lambing when they have their lamb, especially first new mothers, young mothers. They are going to be more combative when they have their babies around them. Allomentic behavior, that's the mimicking behavior. So when a sheep, when they go out to pasture, let's say, and let's just say that one sheep kind of, is the leader, let's call them, and they go out, they graze. Other people, or excuse me, other sheep, other goats are going to see that and want to go out and graze after them. And then since that first sheep is like, oh, or animal, it's like, oh, these people are following me, I'm going to continue to do it. So that's the allomentic behavior. It's just natural mimicking. And we know that sheep are flock animals, but we'll get into that more in a little bit. The mother, young, caregiving, and care-seeking behavior. So this, and we'll talk about all of this a lot more in a little bit, but this is basically just talking about after birth, the mothers are going to lick the placenta up. They're going to, clean up the young. And so that's their bonding time. And then when we get into later, we have lambing crates, and that will strengthen their bond together. Eliminative behavior, it's pretty, we know what that is. So that's defecating, that's urinating, all that good stuff. And then gregarious behavior, that's the flocking, which I mentioned in sheep, and the herding behavior in goats. We'll get into this again in a few minutes, but goats really, if you want to call it flocking or herding behavior, is not as severe or strong as sheep are. And we'll get into this more. I'm going to keep saying this all the time because I'm going to repeat this multiple times, and I'm sorry for that. But then we have ingestive behavior. So this is just talking about, so sheep, when they eat, when they forage, when they graze, they're going to eat the smaller or shorter grasses. And then if they were with cattle, the cattle would eat the taller grasses. Goats are going to go more so for the shrubs, the forbs, the weeds, possibly even tree leaves. So that's what you look for there. Also with that, when we talk about lambing and kidding, within 1 to 2 hours, those babies are going to find those teats that they can nurse on. So they're going to go hard, go strong once they find those. So that happens usually in the first 1 to 2 hours of life. Investigative behavior. So I think goats are probably more prone to do this than sheep. Sheep are very flighty. They don't necessarily like to investigate stuff as much as, let's say, goats. When they do find, if you put something new in a pasture, like a creep feeder of something that I can think of, they're going to obviously be afraid of it at first, but then after a couple of days, the sheep, they'll go up and sniff it and do all that kind of stuff. Goats, on the other hand, they're more, what's the word? They're more gung-ho. They want to do it faster, if you will, than the goats, or than the sheep. They're going to be more investigative in that nature. And then we have sexual behavior. So this is when you talk about, obviously, sheep and goats are short day breeders. So when there's longer nights, they're going to come into estrus and cycling. And you'll hear a lot more about this when you do the reproduction course. So I'm going to just hit on a few topics on that. So ewes and does will lure males in with their aroma, of them going through their cycle. Can't think of what I'm trying to say. But the males, on the other hand, once they smell that, once they react with that, they're going to start pawing at the ground. They might paw at the females. They might even ride each other. So males would ride each other. This is more prevalent in goats, I think, than it is in sheep, but it does happen. So be careful with that. And then shelter-seeking behavior, So let's just say we're on a range. We've got, let's just say a broad number of 500 sheep. That's a lot of sheep, but you don't necessarily have shelter for those sheep because you're on a range. So sheep are going to flock together. That's their mentality. They're going to flock together and kind of they're going to flock together and kind of combat that weather damage. So if winds are coming from one area, they're going to put their rear ends to the wind so that they can shield the rest of their flock, the rest of their herd. Okay. So sheep behavior, so I mentioned this a little bit before, but they are social animals. So they have a strong flocking instinct. They do have good memories. So we always want to make those memories positive instead of negative. They have a flight zone that obviously the more you work with them, that flight zone can lessen or decrease in size. And I'll show you a picture of their flight zone in a little bit. Again, they have poor depth perception because they have those horizontal pupils. Movement, that just means they kind of move as a flock. They follow the leader. If you have one go, generally the others will follow. They might need a little reinforcement, but they got it. They are also very food driven. So if you have food, they will follow you. Sheep they flee danger from groups. So again, the flocking mentality, they're going to flock together and run away. Flocking instinct. And so most of the breeds, which I saw you guys were talking amongst yourselves earlier, that a lot of you have Katahdin. So a lot of this doesn't apply to you because those are hair sheep, but most breeds of sheep do have wool. And so once a year, at least, you will have to shear them. Goat behavior, on the other hand, they are browsers. So you will see them most of the time feeding on, well, not most of the time, but you will see them feeding on shrubs, on bushes, outside of the fence. They actually seek out woody plants and shrubs. They like to eat that. And they are inquisitive. So when you have a goat, let's just say you're showing a goat that they're big now in the show circuit, you want to have some environmental stimuli in there just to keep them busy, because goats are very notorious for getting out of small spaces, of any spaces. So keep them occupied and they won't leave. But they are curious, they're independent. And another way that they differ from sheep is they have a hair coat. They do not have wool. Okay, sight and sound. So I mentioned earlier that they have a well-developed sense of hearing. And so when you make loud noises, when you scream, when something loud happens, sheep are going to flock, or excuse me, they're going to run away from it and flock, I guess, and run away from that. They can capture a wider frequency of sound, both sheep and goats. They do have, we already talked about this, but they do have a binocular vision, or they have a narrow field of binocular vision in front of their head. And they have wide peripheral fields of monocular vision. So they have a blind spot directly behind them. Mating, why this is in here, this is kind of the smell aspect. So especially for goats are male goats, boar goats, buck goats, they will actually pee on their forearms, they'll pee on their brisket, they'll pee on other parts of their body, chest, that area. And that's basically to kind of, because they're so aroused, this is why they do it. So it's a mating sign. That's why goats are generally, or buck goats are generally very smelly, because they do pee on themselves. So sheep, on the other hand, rams do not do that. Any questions so far? We good? Okay, so moving sheep, when we talk about that, they like to move up ground. So they have most of their weight is in the back of their leg, or in the rear leg. So they like to go up. It's hard for them to go down, especially when they're pregnant. We don't want to stress them there. And obviously we don't want to move them in the heat of the day. So don't move them in afternoon, early morning, evening. That's when you want to really do it. And again, sheep have a follow the leader mentality. So they're going, when they see one sheep go ahead, go forward, move, whatever, they're going to intentionally follow them because they see that. I mentioned again that they're food driven. And then rectangular pens have actually been found to be the easiest for holding them, because they can go in and go around. In a square pen, they kind of form a circle and they just keep rotating around, and we don't really want that. We want to decrease, make it as less pressure, as less, what's the word I'm looking for? Make it easier on the sheep, just so that they can more easily blend with that. Also, and this, not necessarily, this is everywhere actually. So ideally you want to have their holding pens so that they can see other sheep. If they're by themselves, they're going to go berserk, right? They're going to go crazy. So we want to make sure they have visuals on other sheep, other animals even around them. Here's the flight zone. So like I mentioned, dependent on if the handler is standing behind them or in front of them, you will get them to move. So if you're standing by their front shoulder, you're going to get them to move backwards. If you're, by the hind quarters, their hips, hip joints, they're going to move forward. So the more you work with them, hopefully this happens, and not all the time does it happen because sheep can be weird. I'm not 100% about goats, but I know sheep, they differ. So every sheep is not going to be the same. So it can be difficult for other sheep, but the more you handle them, the less flighty they should be, just the better overall animal, as long as you do it and not, if you do it in a calm way, they're going to be more prone to come to you, all that kind of stuff. So the fight zone will be decreased. Oh, I can't talk today. All right, Tom, you're up.
Thank you, Kayleigh.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I think that when Kayleigh and I put this presentation together, we agreed, that we really wanted to convey some fundamentals, and I think Kayleigh's done a super job, conveying the concepts. And now we're kind of moving to a part of the presentation, talk about its application, and this kind of gets to the heart of one of the aspects we want to cover tonight. Why do we handle animals, and then what do we need? What infrastructure do we need in order to accomplish that safely for the welfare of the animal and for the welfare of the shepherd? So why do we need to? Well, regardless of the level of management that you apply to your flock, and you have a wide degree of management. Some flocks are managed very intensively. We think of estrus synchronization and artificial insemination, and some sheep are managed very intensively, where others are lambing outside, lambing on pasture, 100% forage with no supplement. So you can imagine, I think that expresses the range of contact you might have with your flock. But regardless, some degree of handling is going to be necessary, and those reasons are administer medicines, vaccines, provide other care. There's also periodic need to sort these sheep at weaning into breeding groups. And once again, we're coming to you tonight from the Mid-Atlantic region, and so we're not talking about super large flocks. And we know a lot of our folks that we work, sheep and goat producers. You're talking about a lot of times fewer than 50 breeding ewes or does. And so you've just got one or two rams, and those rams and bucks, man, they can be such a nuisance. When you think about it, well, to be generous, we could say we only need them for about 40 days out of the year. And you make the argument you only need them for about 20 seconds out of the year. And the rest of the time, they're just hanging out. And so, arranging a place to handle those fertile males where they're out of the way and they're not causing trouble, they're not causing unwanted pregnancies, all that comes into play in terms of how and when we handle them. Now I am, let's see, I think I'm a co-host, and I'm going to try and advance the slides. I don't think I can. If anybody can move me to the next slide. And Kayleigh, I'm moving my cursor. Can you guys see me move my cursor? If not, that's okay. All right, that's fine. So I want to talk about fences and facilities, and there's a general concept. This is a saying that I've heard expressed, and I think it's so true. When we look at making investments in capital items and infrastructure, there's good and durable. There's things that are fast or convenient, and then there's things that are inexpensive. And so when you make decisions about investment in capital items, you can only pick two. You can't have all three. And we're going to see some examples of that. We're going to kind of keep coming back to that. And so a lot of our choices about infrastructure, whether we're building a brand new barn or we're going to work with a pre-existing barn, or we start looking at our corrals or penning systems, there's always going to be trade-offs. And so keep that in mind. Those three things we really like to have. We like it to be really solid and durable and high quality. We like it to be convenient and flexible. We also like it to be inexpensive, and it just can't put all three of those together at once, or very, very rarely can you do that. Next slide. Thank you. So fencing, a lot of times this is our biggest capital expenditure. And I'm going to draw attention first to perimeter fences, because the two most important functions in most cases, most environments, we got to keep those animals where they belong. And this is probably, when you look at insurance claims and any liability issues, overwhelmingly the vast majority of cases where there's a serious liability issue, it has to do with escaped animals. And certainly in higher population, higher density, more densely populated areas, like where I live, because I don't live way out in the country. I actually live in a large lot development, and keep about 50 sheep, and keeping those sheep out of the road is an absolute imperative. So the perimeter fence, its first function we've got to be to keep those animals where they belong. And if we're working with sheep and goats, hopefully a follow-on benefit of having that high quality perimeter fence is we can exclude predators. And on the East Coast of the United States, predators are a huge problem. And so that's an important consideration, not only keeping the animals where they belong, but hopefully excluding predators. Interior fences are a little bit easier. So let's look at the next slide and talk some more about perimeter fences. In Virginia, fence laws are a matter of state decision. Fence laws vary from state to state. Virginia has some very unique aspects to its fence law. Interestingly, most states, when it comes to perimeter fences, most states have some provision where responsibilities relative to a shared boundary fence is shared between the neighbors. And we don't have time to go into that tonight, but as I mentioned earlier, if you're going to keep livestock, there are absolute very serious liability considerations you have to consider about a perimeter fence, and we don't want to be cavalier about our perimeter fence. We need to make sure those sheep are secure and our animals stay where they belong. And also it helps you sleep at night. If you're kind of skating along, if anybody gets to know me, sometimes my construction quality isn't the greatest in the world. You might see some pictures of that tonight. And I manage to sleep at night, but there's other people would look at what I use sometimes, and I don't know if they necessarily sleep as well. But you need that peace of mind. But there's a wide range of choices on perimeter fences, and let's look at next slide, and we'll move through those and kind of look at what those options are. This is a table, of course, as Corey mentioned, as he's bringing people on board to the Google site. You may not have access to the Google site, but I think I know it's a lot of words, but I think to me, these are the pros and cons of these, kind of the broad categories of perimeter fences. I do have some wooden board fence. I live in a pretty nice neighborhood, and I've got neighbors either side of me have nice board fences, and they got to keep up with the Joneses. So on the front part of the place, I went with a wooden board fence. It looks really nice. A lot of maintenance, and where my neighbors all have 3 and 4 boards, I have 5 boards, and because I have sheep, and so it's very attractive, but it's pretty costly. Woven wire is probably, I would dare say, kind of an industry standard for perimeter fences, especially with small ruminants, and I think that's, in my opinion, that's kind of the Cadillac, particularly in the East Coast where we've got predator issues. Well, in the Midwest and the West as well. In the United States, we're just not exempt from predators anywhere. High tensile wire fences can be very, very effective, and they can be suitable for perimeter fences. Generally, once again, I would kind of share my opinions. I think that high tensile wire fences, we really probably need to look at least some of those wires, if not all of them, being electrified. And I'll talk more about electric fences. Nice thing about high tensile wire fences is they're a little bit easier to maintain. They're certainly less expensive to construct, but not necessarily, particularly if it's not carrying electrical charge, maybe not not quite as foolproof as far as sheep and goats being able to creep through it. So that's the trade-off. And then what I think is really the Cadillac for a perimeter fence that, if I had my choice, a woven wire fence with offset electric wires. Those offset electric wires are really nice to have on the perimeter. One, to keep animals off of it so they're not rubbing and scratching on our nice, expensive woven wire fence and protecting it. And also, you've got a ready electrical source for charging cross fences. So once again, my opinion, on the East Coast of the United States, a perimeter fence that's enclosed with a woven wire with an offset, one or two offset electrical wires, I think is really the Cadillac. Correct installation can be tricky. And but there's some professional fence installers, professional fence builders out there that just do super work, and they're super fast. So not inexpensive, but good, durable, and high quality. Let's look at the next slide. All fences, they require maintenance. Anybody who lives on a farm, there is continuous and ever-present maintenance demand. And on the East Coast of the United States, our pastures themselves, the vast majority of our landscape wants to be a forest. That's what it was. It was a forest, or the majority of it was, and it wants to continuously strive to go back to that. And we mow our pastures, but if we ignore our fence rows, that really super nice 30-year asset can turn into a 5-year asset very, very quickly if we ignore this. This is a really nice 6-strand high tensile wire fence. And in Virginia, and I know in other parts of the East Coast, we have an woody invasive called autumn olive. It's a very rapidly growing shrubby type tree. It can grow several feet in a year, and in a matter of 2 years, it will destroy a fence. And so I know some folks really prefer not to use herbicides at all, and I respect that. But maintaining these fences is really important. If you're not going to use herbicides, you're talking about weed eater or some sort of manual removal a couple times a year. And if we do use a herbicide, we might, that's certainly probably going to be a lower labor choice, and broadleaf herbicide on those fences probably in September will keep those fences clean. So an ounce of prevention is worth a pound of cure. Next slide, please. Thank you. Woven wire choices. For those that, here's a little bit about the nomenclature, and this is on the slides. I won't go into detail, but it's something you can refer back to, and there's other sources that explain. But woven wire comes with a numbering system, and this chart explains what the numbers mean and how to interpret it. Probably in the past decade, the big change in woven wire technology has been the fixed knot high tensile woven wire. For many years, the hinge knot woven wire was an industry standard. It's still a good product. It's widely available. It's a little bit less expensive than the fixed knot. The advantage of the fixed knot woven wire, which you see on the right of the slide, is the way that those horizontal and vertical wires are secured to one another. They're secured by an independent knot, an independent piece of wire. So that vertical piece is a continuous, solid stretch of high tensile wire. And from an engineering standpoint, it acts like a miniature post. And that dramatically increases the strength of your woven wire. As a result, your professional fence builders, depending on the terrain and the different design aspects, the heaviness of the wire, that is the number of stays, the number of or the amount of space within the wire design, you can use fewer posts. So a lot of variables in terms of how many posts, but you take a fence design intended for hinge knot, and you apply the same that same design to a fixed knot design. We don't have to use as many posts because the wire itself is more sturdy. Next slide. Once again, kind of referring back to those three choices: good and durable, or inexpensive, or quick and flexible. And welded wire is a good example of that, of where we make that choice. Welded wire is a less expensive choice. It can be more malleable, more easier to work with. It's lighter weight. Certainly for a temporary barrier, can be much preferred to work with. And it is less expensive. However, all the models I've seen, it's a lower gauge wire. It's a lower density wire, so it's a higher gauge. I mean, it's not as thick, it's not as great in diameter, and it's not as strong, and it's not as conducive to stretching. That is a product you would see, and that's a really important quality difference to be aware of. You say, oh, well, here's woven wire. This looks really good. But that distinction of how that wire is constructed is a really important consideration in its durability. If we want to build a fence like this, very effective. I've used it and used it very effectively, and used it for a good number of years. Keeping the vegetation off of it especially is really critical, because it can be bent and weighed down by vegetation very easily. Next slide. Interior fences. We can kind of breathe a little sigh of relief with the interior fences, because it's not as critical. If we have an escape, it's within our perimeter. But we want those interior fences to function, especially if we're trying to control breeding seasons, and if we're trying to implement controlled grazing. Interior fences are really valuable for catching and gathering. And an aspect we're going to touch on here momentarily is that interior fences can be temporary. And I personally, in my little flock, I rely very heavily on temporary fencing and having that flexibility with interior fences for controlling grazing and controlling those rams. Electric fences, and you will encounter different opinions on this. I personally am a big fan of electric fences. I think they're a great innovation. There's been huge advances with electric fence technology in recent decades. And there's some really high quality products out there, very reliable, very effective. You do have to take the time to learn about proper installation and make sure those fences are properly charged, and they need to be checked and maintained to make sure that they are one, that they are safe, and two, that they are carrying a proper charge. So investing in a voltmeter is extremely important, an aspect of maintaining and monitoring those fences. Next slide, thank you. A little more about electric fences. We've got a wide range of options. Mentioned the high tensile fences, which are typically, or rather, they are permanent fences. High tensile fences generally are permanent fences. They can be perimeter fences. And when we look at the interior, that can be a much less expensive alternative for permanent interior fences. And then you've got a wide range of polywire choices. The Gallagher product in the lower right-hand corner, I think they market that as Quick Fence. I've used that product. It's really neat. Deploys 4 strands at one time. It's a little bit fragile, was my experience, and not super durable, but it did deploy very nicely and allows you to put out those 4 strands at one time. So it's a neat product, and get to see one demonstrate or experiment with one. That's a really interesting and neat electric fence product. Electric netting, that's a product I've used a great deal on my little flock. I depend on it very heavily. I've had good success with it as a predator barrier. It has its issues too. I know a lot of people who, if you mention electric netting, that's usually followed by a lot of curse words. There's a lot of people who don't like it. It is a lot of work. And if you're going to deploy electric netting, you better be ready to get your steps in because you're going to walk a lot. But really flexible, gives you a lot of options for paddock layout. And as I mentioned, and my personal success has been that it's been effective predator barrier. It does take regular monitoring to make sure it's properly charged. And I've had some good friends of mine who also raise sheep that they had a bear get in despite a properly charged netting. So not 100% against predators, but I've had good success with it. And then unfortunately, I want to point out the picture in the lower left. There's always drawbacks and there's always trade-offs. Electric netting, do not leave it out in the field up and uncharged. It's a product that you're either going to use it or not. And if you're not using it, you need to take it down and roll it up. And I'm still guilty of that sin of leaving it up and not having it charged. And you have to be very wary of that. In the lower left-hand corner, you see a picture of where I left some netting up. It was deployed, but it was not charged. It was the lower part of the field. And I had some lambs get out. I knew they were out. And I said, well, I'll go get them later. It'll be fine. And a lamb managed to go down there, got into that uncharged netting, got himself wrapped up in it, got him tangled up in it. And I didn't get down there till the next day and found him dead, wrapped up in that electric netting. So there's always trade-offs in making management decisions and choices with the different infrastructure options we have. And so when you can get those cautionary tales from fellow shepherds, it's a take heed and be careful with that electric netting. If you're going to use it, make sure it's properly charged. And when you're done with it, you got to make the time to take it down. Next slide. All right, so let's talk a little bit about corrals. And this is where I kind of reiterate something we've already said multiple times, but I can't say it enough. We really appreciate you joining us. Our presentations are in the context of the Mid-Atlantic. And here you kind of got 3 stages. And what's appropriate for you, for your corrals and your handling system, is largely going to be a function of how many sheep or goats you have. And I've tried to illustrate that here. From the first 5 up to about 30, we can use a combination of panels and T-posts as something fairly flexible and that we can put together fairly inexpensively, and it'd be quite effective. But as our numbers increase, the imperative that those handling systems and those corrals be more substantial and more sturdily built becomes more critical. So in the lower left hand, you see a combination of purchased and constructed panels put together, very effective. You can set up in the open field. You can gather 20 to 30 head and get done what you need to do. And so it's a really nice functional system. But as you move up, and this is something of a matter of opinion, once you get up above 50 head, the necessity of having a more substantial handling system begins to increase. And this is a picture some of you may have seen. I think it's a good illustration. This happens to be the Premier One sheep supply and fencing company out in Iowa. That's their handling system. And I think that's illustrative of something that where we would handle anywhere from 100 to, maybe upwards to 500 ewes through a system like that. And then of course, there's the, Australia, New Zealand that's handling thousands of sheep. Now, if you're a sheep enthusiast like me, there are some super cool YouTube videos. I think it's the ProWay livestock handling systems out of Australia, where you can see videos of their livestock handling systems for sheep that they've designed for, 5,000 and 10,000 sheep. And that's just a whole nother order in terms of handling facility. Really cool to watch, but really for our region, rarely has much application because the vast majority of our flocks and on the East Coast of the United States are going to be certainly under 1,000 and more typically under 75 head. So that's, I think, some important context when you look at the slides I have related to handling facilities. Another quick note, that you've got a selection of and a variety of hurdles. I'll refer to them as hurdles or panels, same thing. But you can either construct or purchase hurdles that are very suitable for sheep, but not suitable for goats. And I had a direct experience with this. I had to temporarily hold for one night a small group of goats for a friend of mine, and they unloaded them into my sheep corral. And within 10 minutes, I had 2 goats out. They crawled right through those panels, and the panels that had always worked for my sheep. So that's a behavioral aspect and the nature of goats that makes them different. So you got to make sure that you're getting something that is appropriate for the species you're working with. Next slide. Talk a little bit about trade-offs, and I think that in terms of arriving at a good compromise for those of us that have these small and medium-sized flocks, these portable panels, and I'll switch back and forth interchangeably, refer to them as hurdles or panels. Portable panels where they're homemade or manufactured and then used in combination with metal T-posts, fastening with wire or twine, tie wire or rope. These can really, you can very quickly construct a very substantial and very suitable corral system. And the positive, the pros of this is it allows you to experiment with different configurations. You can take it down and when it's not in use, or if you need to rearrange the configuration. We'll talk more about that when we get into housing. The cons, of course, are it requires physical strength to drive those T-posts. In my picture to the left, you see I've got a T-post driver and a T-post puller, and those are 2 tools that I do not lose. Well, I try not to lose them. Those are 2 I use a lot, and that T-post driver, it does take some physical strength, but boy, in the East Coast, our soils, most of our soils, you can get those T-posts driven in and have a nice solid barrier, and then getting them back up out of the ground when you're done with them. That T-post puller, as it gives you a lever, and boy, it doesn't take too much strength to pull that T-post back up. So that's a system I've been very happy with. I'm handling about 50 sheep, and I'm not saying it's the absolute right, but just trying to share with you those pros and cons. And the cons are it does require some physical strength to get those T-posts set. And if you're not careful about some construction points and how we use those T-posts relative to the positioning of the panel, sometimes those pins can fail and you got sheep that get out and goats that escape. So, and the other thing is I do use either tie wire or twine, and that can make a mess. If you're not careful about policing that stuff up as it breaks or as you get done with it, then you wind up with these bits of string and wire laying all around the farmstead. And that's kind of a nuisance. So can be a con. Another con with the T-post, while I'm thinking of it, I want to make sure and point out, is a safety issue. And particularly if you have multiple species, I'm a recovering horse enthusiast, a recovering horse addict, you might say. In my younger days, rode horses a good bit, and horses and sheep are probably, in some respects, their fencing needs are diametrically opposed. And I've heard some horror stories of horses getting injured on T-posts. A good safety practice, regardless whether you have horses or not, they make a plastic cap that's used as an electric fence insulator. It's a plastic cap that goes on top of those T-posts. And I'm not always good about using them, but that is a good safety precaution to have those plastic caps. It's not a guarantee. A person or a horse could still get injured on a T-post, but that plastic cap is a good safety thing to put on those T-posts to hopefully limit injury. A lot of times I'll be climbing a corral panel and find myself suspended over one of my T-posts. And I'm always thinking, I hope my feet don't slip, I'll impale myself on that T-post. So all, that safety concern is there. And so you got to balance that between the pros and the cons. Let's look at next slide. Looking at these temporary panels and hurdles a little more in depth, here's a couple of setups I've used. Notice in that top picture, the panel is on the outside of the T-post. So if I'm going to put 5 sheep in there, it's probably going to work. But if I'm going to put 30 sheep in there, I'm taking a pretty big chance because I'm relying on the tie, whether it's a string or a rope or a wire, I'm relying on that tie to do all the work. And look at the bottom. I hope you can see that's a panel that's been attached to a T-post. That if the sheep are on the right side, when those sheep press up against it, then the wooden panel and the T-post all work together to restrain those sheep. If you've got your livestock on the other side, then all the pressure is borne by whatever fastener you've used. And I've intentionally, shown 3 different ties there. There's some 16 gauge tie wire. There's a piece of nylon rope, and there's some baler twine, which I bet there's more than a few people listening, watching tonight that have used baler twine as a construction material. I'm sure I'm not alone in that anyway. So those are all, kind of considerations. When you're, looking at setting up corrals and handling areas for our small flock sizes, small and medium-sized flocks. This is can be a really good system, but you just got to keep those pros and cons in mind so that you can protect yourself from those unfortunate incidents that I've kind of talked about. Let's see our next slide. Chutes and raceways. Here, this is once again depends on the size of flock that you have. When I was 30 years old, for me to crowd up a group of 40 sheep and wade into a group of 40 sheep and check the eyes and deworm sheep and just to crowd it up in a pen, I was ready to do that with 40 sheep. By the time I was 45, I wasn't so crazy about that. So, as we get older and maybe get a little wiser, understanding, it is, you've got time constraints and lots of different constraints that limit whether we can afford to invest in a chute system. But I think, in my opinion, I think this is probably one of the first constructed, manufactured products that I would consider investing in terms of infrastructure. On the left is a chute system. Well, I won't tell stories on myself tonight. I'll tell you, I attempted to build, and it failed. And once again, we make this choice. We have good and durable. You've got fast and flexible, and you've got inexpensive. Well, I think with a constructed system that you just build out of wood, you can have good and durable. And it can, if you're able to source your materials inexpensively, can be relatively inexpensive. The problem is it really takes some pretty precise carpentry to get that chute sized correctly, because it's really imperative that the chute is the correct width. And with the one I attempted to build that I am now in the process of tearing out that failed, it was too wide and it had issues with the sheep turning around, especially where I had a turn or a corner or a turn in the raceway. It was too wide and the sheep were always turning around in it, and it's extremely frustrating. The one on the left, on the right, the one on the right is, of course, a manufactured one. And you'll notice how that design, it is narrower at the bottom. Now this has the option. You can set it up so that it is the same width at the top as it is at the bottom, or you can set it so the bottom is narrower, and the narrower bottom really limits the animal's ability, where sheep or goat, their ability to turn around in the chute. And I don't know if you can see in the picture, but there are also backstop gates in that. That's a spring-loaded gate. So once they pass it, if they back up, they hit that gate and they can't back up on you. And those are just really nice. It's just a really nice feature to have. uh, I guess those are the main points I would make about a raceway. As far as the numbers are concerned, it really is a matter of personal preference. But I really think once you get up to 20 head of breeding ewes or breeding does, you're really going to want to seriously consider having some sort of a raceway, because it makes handling them so much easier. That's our next slide. I think the animal health section, they'll talk about foot bath. I thought I'd throw this picture in here. On the left, that's a foot bath I constructed. Now I'm retaining that. You kind of got to manhandle those sheep into that to get them to go in it. That is as a poured concrete bottom. I just built a little form and poured a concrete trough that can hold the copper sulfate solution, or zinc sulfate solution is what I use. And you can kind of manhandle them in there, and I've got gates I can feature at each end and can affix at each end. And very functional foot bath, can do about 3 sheep at one time. And then, of course, the manufacturers that have the manufactured raceways, they have inserts that you can put in those raceways for a foot bath. And I'll let in the flock health presentation, they'll talk about foot care and management of foot issues. So I just wanted to show a picture of that in terms of infrastructure options. So what's our next slide? And then kind of finishing up on the raceways, you can see, kind of typically you have a larger catch pen. If our time allows this evening, I've got a video hopefully we can share. I think does a really nice job showing some aspects of catch pen and handling design. But that catch pen, that manufactured portable panel, they hinge together. I can swing it around and close it behind the sheep, move them down to this funnel area. That's the picture that's in the center, where those 2 wings kind of form a funnel, the guillotine gate, and then they go down the race. And that's they don't flow perfectly through there. Certainly old ewes, after they've been through there a few times, they get the hang of it and they know where to go. And just a really nice handling system, for very functional for 30 to 50 ewes. Once you start getting above 50 ewes, that's where relying on the portable panels and the T-post set, it gets a little iffier, and we got to be a little more careful because it's just a lot more physical pressure on those individual points in the system. The next slide. Restraints. Even the large operations will still, use a crowd area, a funneled area where they can go through and crowd sheep. In the module where we talk about internal parasite control, they'll go into more detail with that. There you see a picture of a guy in a crowd pen where he's drenching lambs, and but that remains, even with a race. We still have times where having a crowd pen it's really the most functional way to handle sheep. So that's an imperative, I think. Even if you got 1 or 2, we need to have a way to funnel those sheep into a crowded area. I haven't done some shearing for small flocks. I'm very uncomfortable with that, relying on the sheep walking up to the feed bucket and then us grabbing their collar or grabbing their halter. And if you may just have 3 or 4, it's they come up to the bucket and I'll grab their halter. That's sometimes it works, sometimes it doesn't. If we just have a crowd pen where we can coax them in and crowd them up, it's a lot less stress on everybody. In the handling, if you ever have the opportunity to do an in-person hands-on class, if you haven't done this, certainly setting the sheep on his backside, on her backside, that is a centuries-old method of restraint and handling sheep. It's really kind of a fundamental aspect of being a shepherd, and regardless, it's a way to inspect and treat individual sheep and manage them as an individual. And once again, it's a lot easier to do this if we've got a crowd pen where they're within easy reach, and a lot less stress on the animal and on the shepherd if we can do that. Also featured here a picture of a restraint. I have personally not used this. I want to feature it just because I see it sold commercially. I take it back. I think I've used it once. And I've, different participants may have had different experiences with that particular type of a yoke to restrain a sheep. My sense is, and I'm going to speak here, not having used it a great deal, their rear legs are still free. So it can help you restrain them, but you're still going to have to be with that animal and probably somehow sit on them or restrain them, because their rear legs are going to flail. But that is a restraint device that's out there you might see. And maybe in our question and answer period, we can share some thoughts about whether that's an effective restraint mechanism or not. What's our next slide? In the animal health, or in our flock health module, we'll talk about foot care. These are some aids in handling sheep. Particularly if we're handling a lot of sheep, that setting them up on their backside and relying on our knees and legs to restrain the sheep, that can be a lot of work. The deck chair, there's several manufacturers of this product, and I have used them, and they can be very effective. It's a pretty simple device and very reasonably priced. If you're a lot of sheep, the turntables, and there's a lot of different designs out there. I don't know enough about them to make any particular comment other than the turntables. Particularly if you're handling a lot of sheep, you can be very useful for doing work on their feed, and for other cases where we've got to fully restrain another animal. I just wanted to share that. What's our next slide?
And do it. There you go.
There we go. We're going to kind of change gears here a little bit and talk about feeders. And actually, I guess, Corey, I've really gone on quite a while here. I don't know how I'm doing on time, and if we want to stop and take some questions about handling facilities, or we want to keep going.
I would suggest you just keep going. We could take a few questions if people have them right now on their mind, but we've got time, and you're presenting a lot of good stuff. So it's whatever you want to do.
If anybody's got any burning questions, that think or comments, I certainly don't necessarily put myself out there as the expert, but I feel like in the context of us smaller scale sheep producers, with maybe under 100 ewes or 100 does, I feel like these infrastructure pictures I've shown have good application. Just put in the chat box and we'll monitor that. I'll move on and we'll talk about feeders a little bit. Some of you might be familiar with this, and I've used feeders like this. They're super nice. Those doubles, I'm talking about the one on the right, a double-sided combination hay feeder and grain feeder, a really nice product, and a nice design. The ones I've used, you could there's actually just enough width you could walk down the center of them, and you could feed hay through, let the grain fall or pellets fall down through the panel there, the wire panel that holds the hay, and then chuck the hay in there. So that's a neat design. On the left, upper left, is a very similar design. I guess it's basically the same design but cut in half. The advantage of that is you've got a kind of like a fence line feeder, and that feeder, they can be put in series, and so you have a barrier, and actually a substantial barrier, and you can very quickly feed a lot of sheep without getting knocked down and the sheep jumping up on trying to knock the bucket out of your hand and all that. You keep a barrier between you and the sheep. So they're nice designs. There's always pros and cons. There's always, those are the pros. The con is they're heavy. And so if you want to move them, or if you want to have flexibility, it pretty much takes a tractor to move them. I have gotten on one end and got a pretty strong dude on the other end. Two people can move them, but they are heavy and they're pretty awkward to move. So if you don't got a tractor, you better be content with wherever you construct it and you leave it, because it's going to be pretty hard to move it. Round bale feeders, there's a number of designs there, and I just showed one. And I don't want to be biased toward one, but there are a number of different round bale designs. If you're a fiber person, how we feed hay can be really critical. If you're really interested in your fleeces and your fiber, we might have to make some compromises and maybe waste a little bit of hay feeding on the ground, because those hay feeders and hay nets, well, maybe not hay nets. Hay nets can actually be pretty clean way of feeding hay, but certainly these round bale feeders and round bales, they can really incorporate a lot of that hay into their fleeces quickly. So that's a consideration for our fiber producers. I did cheer for a lady who was using a hay net, and she had beautiful clean fleeces, and those sheep came worked the hay out of that hay net. It was a web bag. The problem is it was a pretty time consuming process to fill those bags, and she was only feeding a few sheep, so it wasn't too much of a burden for her, but it would be difficult to do that at scale. So next slide. The alternative, if we want something flexible, if we want to have a means of delivering a pelleted feed on pasture, is the old feed pan. And the drawback is, so we've got something lightweight, something we can change and move very easily. But now the drawback is it's on the ground, it gets dirty, gets rainwater in it. And also it's, if we just put it out there in the field, there's no barrier between shepherd and sheep when we go to feed. Now, this is my particular situation. It's the winter time. I've got a sacrifice area that I'm letting them kind of tear up, that I know I can reseed and recover that pasture by reseeding it. And if you see on the picture on the left, the sheep are behind a solid barrier, and that's where they go down to graze and to get hay. And then I exclude them from there. I put the feed out in the pans that are scattered out, and this is a paddock that's boarded by electric netting. And once I deploy the feed, then I could go down, open the gate, and they all come running in and feed themselves. So that's an option on feeders. And those feed pans, pretty handy when we've got 30 or fewer. But once you get up to 50 breeding animals, or more than 50 animals, boy, now you're talking about 20 or 25 pans. So you've got those trade-offs. So next slide. Here's an option that in terms of incorporating the feed trough into the gate panel, and this is actually something I came up with myself. Trying to strike that balance between something I can move and is pretty flexible. It doesn't take a tractor to move it, but at the same time is sturdy enough that it presents itself as a sturdy barrier. And so these are constructed in a way, they move individually like a panel, and they've got the trough there at the bottom. And then I just use T-posts and I put them in series. So in order more or less to construct a feeding fence, and I can work down one side and deploy all the grain into the trough from the one side, and the sheep come running in from the other side, and I don't have to worry about getting knocked down or overrun by sheep that are desperate to get their feed. So lots of options out there, and that particular, something that's homemade. And I'm fortunate I live close to two building supply stores that periodically put coal lumber out on the back side of the building that they got at reduced price because it's warped or cracked, or for whatever reason, it's not first run lumber, and I'm able to pick up that lumber pretty cheap. And all of that there, as you can see, it's kind of wonky, but it's all made from coal lumber, and it's quite functional. Sheep do like to jump up in them and stand in them, and they're pretty hard on it. So there's always a little bit of repair that needs to be done to one of them or two of them. So that's an example. You have some feeder options that it can be handy. What's our next slide. So we're going to move into housing. I want to turn it back over to Kayleigh, because we've got, some behavioral considerations when we look at housing. So Kayleigh.
Well, thank you, Tom. So housing, this is more so, I guess, geared towards sheep. Some of these could possibly apply to goats as well. And it's mostly geared towards Virginia. So I'm sorry for all of those who are not in Virginia. But because Virginia climate is so mild, sheep do not necessarily need shelter all year round. So generally want to give them shade in the summertime. It can be hot, it's humid here. And then in the winter, there could be some crazy snows, ice, whatever. So they would, it'd be preferable to have some shelter during those months as well. As far as the types of shelter, they can have an enclosed barn, and we'll get into a little bit more of this later. You need to make sure that you have adequate ventilation for a fully enclosed barn, because if you don't, the ammonia is going to get in there. You're going to have a lot of problems in your ewes, possibly rams, whatever, lambs especially. So we want to make sure in our lambing barns that we do that. And then, like I mentioned, I guess a little bit indirectly, shelter is needed mostly during the lambing season. And we keep getting into this, and I keep saying this, but obviously that's going to be for the mother lamb bonding time. So that's why it's more so needed in the lambing season. Also, the lambs can get cold, and we don't want that. So back to the summertime. In Virginia, we'll say, this can be applied other places as well, but generally focused in Virginia at the moment. Shade is needed, but wherever you have, so if you have a portable shade mechanism, such as the picture there, you have to be cognizant that the sheep they're going to go out, they're going to forage, they're going to do whatever, but then they're going to come back to that spot in the heat of the day, and they're going to defecate, they're going to urinate. So you're going to get a lot of buildup of manure. And sheep obviously have parasite loads. So we need to make sure that we're warming our sheep, number one, and that, we kind of clear it out, move them. The portable ones are an option, but they really don't accommodate a large number of sheep. So if you're a small scale sheep producer, goat producer, a portable shade device would be adequate. It would work for you. Another thing that you can do is a silvopasture, which, if you haven't heard of those, it's basically having pasture in a field and planting trees there. That's going to take a long time for the trees to actually grow and produce shade. So you have to be cognizant of that. You have to give trade-offs and decide which one works best for you. So now that we talked about that, we can talk more about ewe care. This is especially at lambing, and so I'll get back to lambing jugs and all that kind of stuff. But before our ewes, especially wool breeds, we want to make sure that they're crushed. And this is not necessary. Let me say this. It's not necessary, but it will help the lamb to find the teats, to start nursing, to get that colostrum, to get that first milk. So it is adequate, and it does help. It allows the lambs to find the teats easier. So we're just gonna shear around the udder, around the dock, around the vulva, under the flank, all that kind of stuff. So we're gonna just make it easier for the lambs to find the teat so that they can nurse is the reason for doing that. Okay, so when we talk about pre-lambing and pre-kidding behavior, so this is all going to be in your does and in your ewes. So both of these species are going to separate themselves from the rest of the group. So they're going to go off feed, they're going to start acting a little odd, different. You might hear them make some sort of, I'm going to call it a bleat, but it's not going to be a bleat, it's going to be a low murmur almost. And that's kind of just getting ready for the lamb to come, the kid to come, so that they can have that bond already. So the lamb, the animal, the baby knows kind of their mother's voice, if you will. So that's why they do that. Also, the ewes or does will appear to make a nest. So they'll paw at the ground. I think I mentioned this earlier, just so that they can exhibit that behavior. They're trying to find a nest somewhere that they can have their babies. And then I already mentioned about the short vocalizations. So the picture in the bottom left, that's actually a doe. I think we know that, but you can't really tell it, but there is mucus coming out of her vulva. So that was just kind of a picture, a very bad picture. I should have gotten a better one for you. But that's just kind of showing that because mucus is discharged from the vulva when ewes and does are getting ready to kid or lamb. As they get closer to parturition, they're going to sit down, stand up. They seem like they can't get comfortable. So they're gonna arch their back. They're gonna repeatedly lie down, get back up again, all that kind of stuff. They're very uncomfortable at this stage. And then right before they're gonna give birth, they're gonna have a water bag. And so that's gonna come out first, and then you have the baby, and then you have the afterbirth. So this is what happens. So this is them. So the water bags come out. You have a doe here who's giving birth to a kid. So this is a normal presentation. You'll learn a lot more about this in the reproduction class, but just forearms with the head in between the forearms, on top of the forearms is the normal presentation there. All right, so when they do lamb or kid, you want to put them immediately into a little section where they can have that bonding mother lamb kid bonding time. And we know lambs have more, or ewes, have more than one lamb generally, not all the time. So this is just so they don't forget, so they know who their babies are. Actually, back up one second. In the previous slide, I did forget to mention that as lambs, as ewes are getting ready to give birth, they might even take another, so if another ewe has lambs, those other ewes might take that lamb thinking it's their own because they're so ready, they're ready to have this baby, so they might kind of steal, if you will, a lamb from another ewe or what have you. But when they do have their babies, they're going to be placed in lambing pens, and these are generally 4 feet square, so 4 feet by 4 feet, and they can be up against the walls of a barn. You can do these, I guess you can build them freestanding, so they don't have to be against the wall, whatever have you. So the reason that we do this is so that the lambs don't get trampled. Again, you can have that bond, and eliminates the possibility that the lambs are going to walk away, they're going to get lost, they're going to be chilled. So they have the warmth there. They're in a barn generally, so they're going to be warm, they're going to be safe, they're going to have that mother baby bonding time. And then again, it lessens the danger of disowned lambs. So that's a little bit about lambing jugs. So when we talk about the space requirements for these, so this is kind of a confusing slide or chart, but it depends. There's differences between a dirt lot, an open shed, a confinement situation with a dirt floor, and a confinement situation with slatted floors. So these are going to be, so the numbers that you see are all square feet. So you have a bred ewe, 20 square feet in a dirt lot. And then if you go down to the ewe with the lambs, obviously she's going to need more square feet because there's more surface area of lambs. Lamb, ewe, they're all going to be in there together. If she's in an open shed, you're going to need 12 square feet for space requirements. So a ewe, let's say she has 2 lambs, they would have 12 square feet for their lambing pens or lambing jugs, whatever have you. And then you can see the different criteria for different confinement options, housing options on that front. Goats, on the other hand, are going to generally, and let me back up a second, because you can have lambing jugs for one season of the year. Your lambing season, you can take them down. This works for kids and for ewes, or excuse me, for does and ewes. So you can always take them down. They're kind of flexible in that front. But those are placed in jugs during kidding and 3 to 5 days after kidding. Same for ewes, you might keep them a little longer, especially if there's, I don't know, something wrong. It depends on that front. And this allows the producer to ensure that the newborn the newborn kids get the right amount of colostrum. So you want the animals also the lambs to get colostrum as soon as possible, the 12 to 24 hours after birth. Lambs are going to be more visible than kids are. So kids kind of go hide for a little bit and then they come out. They might hide for a couple of days and they come out. Lambs, you can generally find them, for the most part, you can find them right after, a day after. They're pretty kind of different in that front. So their mothers, for goats, will kind of have them off the side. They're not, no one's looking at them basically. So they're gonna kind of be hidden and then they'll come about a couple of days old. Ewes, on the other hand, they might lamb in some brush or something of that nature, but you can generally find them. And they're easier to find, let's say, than does and kids are. So these are some examples of lambing jugs. I don't have any goats, but goats can obviously use this as well. You can see what Tom talked about earlier. We have some T-posts. There's actually one from Virginia Tech. Got a Virginia Tech bucket in there. So we're using T-posts. We're using wooden fences, wooden gates. We have some industrialized gates on the left side. So these are just some examples of lambing or kidding pens. So back to proper housing, So proper housing, you need to have optimal airflow. So we don't want to create, the reason for that optimal airflow is because we don't want to create a space or place for respiratory diseases to happen. This is why it's really important when you have lambing jugs during lambing season, because little babies, obviously, I think babies, humans, everything, they're going to be more prone to get sick quicker. That's why they need that colostrum, they need proper housing, they need all that kind of stuff. So the biggest one that we see in sheep and possibly goats is pneumonia. So it can be viral, it can be caused by bacteria, by a parasite. So you want to make sure that we have ventilation. So this can, depending, and then the next slide, we can see more pictures of that. But you want to have proper ventilation. You want to have windows, you want to have fans, possibly even, so you can get good circulation. If you have, let's say, a lambing barn, you want to make sure, and it's enclosed, we'll say, you might open the door or some windows or something. But in order to really see or understand, if you will, the amount of ammonia that's in there, first of all, you're going to want to clean it regularly, because if you don't, that ammonia is going to be built up. There's feces, there's urine, all that kind of stuff. So ammonia plays a big part in ammonium pneumonia. Anyway, so you want to make sure that we clean those out, or clean our lambing pens out, ventilate it. So if you do have improper airflow in your lambing shelters, we'll call them, it will be more economic loss to you, because you're losing lambs to pneumonia, respiratory diseases. And this is, generally ewes are lambing in the cold months, right? So we want to make sure that we have all the proper tools to allow them to live their life to the fullest, not getting sick, all that kind of stuff. So the bottom left picture, Tom actually gave that picture. We just wanted to show that this is a cold day, I think it was. I don't know if it was this year or last year, relatively recently. But you can see that there's sheep on the far side of the picture next to the tree. They're in the shade. Sheep have a very high tolerance for cold. So generally lambs they're newborn. So we do want them to be warm, but as they age, they're going to be kind of tolerant to cold weather. So in this picture, let's just say, I don't know, 20 degrees, Tom? I don't know.
Yeah.
Do you remember what
Yeah.
Okay.
It was probably colder than that, like 15.
Okay.
15 Fahrenheit.
So it's just showing that the ewes that are in the shade, they're kind of close together. That's what they do when they are cold. They're going to flock together. So they also have wool on them. So wool obviously is going to encase their heat. They don't need to be in the sun for any reason. They do have ewes that are out kind of sunbathing. They may be foraging, grazing, that sort of thing. But generally, sheep don't necessarily need to be out in the sun. They can be, so what I'm saying is they can stay in the shade and they'll be just fine. Anything else you want to add on that, Tom?
No, I think it was a cold morning, and you would think any animal would want to stretch out there in the sun, and they were all laid up and they weren't necessarily that close together, but they were more content to be out of the sun. And on a morning where there's no wind and no air movement, they had full fleeces. They were perfectly content to be in that shade.
Right. And so the picture on the left is just giving you an example of slatted floors there. And then I don't know if the thing on the right, I don't know if that's a slatted floor, but they've got straw in there. So you want to be sure that you clean that out regularly because, like I mentioned before, they're going to be urinating, defecating. Lambs are going to be in that straw. So you want to make sure that they, lessen the chances of them getting a respiratory disease. So clean that out regularly. All right, here's ventilation. So good ventilation is an absolute must. This is what I was talking about before. We don't want our barns, especially our lambing barns, and I see that the pictures didn't do right. We don't want them to be closed up because, again, this is going to cause respiratory problems in our lambs, maybe even our ewes, who the heck knows. But if you can smell ammonia in your barns, that means that the ventilation is not good. If you get down, let's just say on your knees, all fours, and you can really smell it there, that's what your lambs are smelling. That's what your lambs are prone to. That's what they're breathing in. We don't want that. That's going to lead to respiratory diseases that we don't want. That could be detriment to your operations. So when thinking about that, it's better to overventilate than it is to underventilate. So if you look at the picture in the bottom left, there's a lot of open space there. So a lot of airflow coming through. It's creating ventilation, proper ventilation. It might even be overventilated, but that's okay. We want that. We want to lessen the chances of our babies, lambs and kids to, get pneumonia and respiratory diseases. So what lambs need, what babies need, they need a dry, draft-free place. And so this is what, ewes when they give birth, this is what they need as well. So goats, on the other hand, are particularly vulnerable to respiratory infections and to hypothermia if they do not have access to shelter during cold and rainy weather. So that's not only sheep, goats. I think that sheep also might play a little bit of a part in there. Sheep are probably better. They don't necessarily have that. They're not as vulnerable, I'll say, but there is still a vulnerability aspect there. So I think, and then it has all the concentration of ammonia is higher, closer to the ground because of its density. So young animals are especially affected by high concentrations of ammonia in poorly ventilated barns. So that's why just be mindful of, the amount of ammonia that's in the barns if you do have barns. Oops. All you, Tom.
Thank you, Kayleigh. Yeah, and going to pick up on that theme. Understand, we used some illustrations, some pictures there, knowing that kind of fancy your barns to mainly to frame the context of our conversation. But understand the vast majority of us are going to be using, well, I would say in most cases we're working with pre-existing structures, and some of you may have the opportunity. Now, I have not paid much attention to the chat. I think there's some really good, from what I can gather, there's been some really good ideas and thoughts shared on the chat. And I appreciate that opportunity. I think we got some experienced shepherds out there sharing their ideas and experiences. I saw a couple of questions about flooring, and I am going to get to that and touch on that. I do want to, before we get too far from it and we get into shelters and barns, I want to back up just a little bit and talk about pasture lambing. Now, that's a management strategy, and I think it's going to be talked about in the other modules, but as far as housing, I do want to touch on it here in the context of the East Coast of the United States. I've done pasture lambing, and there are some folks with whether goat or sheep flocks, very devoted to all forage systems and pasture lambing or pasture kidding, and it can work. I really like it. You know, we take away a lot of these environmental challenges. If she can get off to herself and drop her lambs or kids in the place of her choosing in a nice, clean, open pasture, and she can have 6 to 8 hours by herself on that nice, clean, green, early spring pasture. And those kids or lambs, they get right up and they don't ever have to come in the barn. And that is achievable. But there is a long list of management considerations that need to go into, you know, successful pasture lambing or pasture kidding. And we don't have time to go into that. We're focused on housing tonight. But the one comment I would say relative to the shepherds out there that are interested in pasture lambing, it's a good system. I've had some experience, and I've spent some time, you know, studying the work of some really excellent shepherds who are very good at it. But the one cautionary note I would make is that when we get a night where we've got temperatures 50, 45, or 40 degrees Fahrenheit and rain, which is not that uncommon in the mid-Atlantic of the United States, that we can, even in late April, we can have nighttime temperatures down in the 40s with, if not pouring rain, drizzling rain. And you get a little baby lamb or kid, unlike a calf, that's a lot of surface area in a baby lamb or baby kid that is exposed to that cold, that cold rain, and a lot of surface area relative to their internal organs. So those lambs and kids will chill very, very quickly if they're lambing out on pasture. So I think when we look at management, we look at the value of these lambs and kids, that even if we've got an all forage system, or, you know, we're lambing later in the spring and we're out in the open, we're nice and clean, we've got good ventilation, all those good things, we probably need to have some sort of a plan for shelter. And I've you know, experimented with different portable shelters, setting up panels, actually have set up a jug in the pasture, and that's a doable option, you know, to get them through that first night. Put a plywood board over top of that jug to keep the rain off of them, and make sure that, you know, that those babies have mothered up and they've kept the worst of the weather off of them. So understanding that pasture lambing or pasture kidding strategy, that's absolutely an aspect of management. And you may be thinking, if you're new to it, say, well, I don't really need a barn, or we're not going to use a barn. But I think having some sort of a shelter plan, you know, is important for those newborns, because on the mid-Atlantic United States, you can certainly be caught with that difficult weather. A lot of us shepherds are working with pre-existing barns. So in the upper right-hand corner, this is really a very typical old barn that it's set up with a pole design, and it's divided into bays. And so you got a long, relatively narrow bay that we go in and put in these movable panels, as a dirt floor. And so we can bed it down. And when we're done, we open up those double gates at the end and come in with a front end loader or skid steer, whether you got one or you hire your neighbor to come in. And so there's aspects of that design that they're quite good. It looks to me like in that picture, I don't know where that barn is, but looks to me like they added those windows after the fact to let in natural light. And also that's an option for adding some additional ventilation. You can close them when it's really windy and cold. I know with some of our smaller flock producers that there's a number of different small shelter designs. There's even some that are portable, designed to be put on the skids. The pros of them, they are flexible, they're movable. The cons is that if they're not properly designed, the animals might be disinclined to go into them because they're not necessarily real crazy about feeling confined unless they get really trained and to go in there. My biggest contention with them, I make a little tongue-in-cheek comment on this slide, is you better put your helmet on before you go in there, because you got to hunch over, and if you've got a sheep or a goat that's down or needs treatment, or you're trying to catch them and they go in there and you go in after them, you're hunched over trying to work with that animal. And I've banged my head more than a few times on those small portable shelters, and that's a con. And I personally am not a big fan. I'm not a big fan of those small portable shelters. Once again, in terms of looking at those trade-offs, the more open the floor plan, the greater the versatility. Next slide, please. What's our next slide? And I just caught a glimpse. I know some folks talked about flooring options. Yeah, there's an advantage with concrete in that it's certainly can be easier to clean, and when it's clean, you can sanitize it. My experience as an observation with it, even if you put a rough finish on it, it can be slippery. And but probably what's biggest deal with me is that once that concrete's poured, there's no changing it. So it's very difficult to alter the floor plan, and securing panels or gates that's in any way different from what you originally designed it with the posts in place. It really can be difficult to do. My other observation with the concrete floor is it can be really cold, and you get with a dirt floor, you do get some natural warmth coming from the earth, even though it doesn't seem that warm. It's warmer than concrete. Dirt floors, of course, are less expensive. They allow for, you already kind of got the idea. I'm a big fan of these T-posts on these small flocks. It gives us a lot of flexibility. Whether they're T-posts or wooden posts, we can go in there and change things pretty easily. But when we go to clean them out, if we hire a guy to come in with his skid steer and clean out our barn, if he's not careful, he'll tear up half the clay that's there. And so you got to be careful with how we take front end loaders or other equipment in there, and disrupt that nice dirt floor that we've got. And well, I think this applies to all our structures that we haven't talked about, but especially in these barns with dirt floors, we got to be cognizant of drainage issues and making sure that floor gets properly drained and is adequately sloped, so that we're not collecting rainwater and that floor will drain out. We had a picture earlier. In very rare circumstance, you might encounter a slatted floor design. There was some experimentation done with this back in the 70s and 80s. And there's some applications in larger, big commercial sheep operations, particularly in shearing sheds, where they'll have slatted floors trying to keep the fleeces clean. Not a common application for most of our flocks on the East Coast. It's a very specialized barn design, but the application could be in these circumstances where we're trying to create a pathogen-free, and in particular parasite-free environment, because of the slatted floor, all the manure and urine drops away. And so that it is a kind of an interesting environmental challenge. I personally I'm big on grazing and forage utilization, so slatted floors just don't really, that's not in my roundhouse. So next slide. I think this might be my last slide, and I think this is just a kind of a really common, very simple type of barn structure you find a lot of times pre-existing. It's pole barn. And you'll even see these out in the large sheep operations in the West. These kind of low slung, maybe they're not more than, 8 feet tall at the lower edges, and in the center, that ridge cap, maybe it's no more than 12 feet tall. And a simple pole barn construction, and very functional. Got a dirt floor, and it's got a lot of aspects to it that perfectly functional for anywhere from a small number of sheep to actually a quite large flock. With the pole barn construction, the materials costs are lower, but those pole supports can get in the way. And that's where a free span design, we had some earlier pictures of these hoop house type structures that have a free span, and that's certainly adds a dimension of flexibility where you don't have to work around those poles. But with a free span design, you've got materials considerations and engineering considerations, because your snow load is going to have to be carried by that free span, the full width of that roof. So you got to make sure it's engineered properly. Then this barn, you get an old structure like this, it can be pretty easy to adjust ventilation. And one thing, it can be kind of contradictory at times, is figuring out the difference between the draft and ventilation, and it can be a fine line between the two. A structure like this sometimes, is adding a gap in that roof, either it's overshot ridge cap or some type of a roof vent down the very peak of that gable, can really help with ammonia and allow that to get fresh air in. And then if you go to the sides, it's not featured in this picture, but sometimes some hinged slats strategically located along the sides of the barn can allow that airflow to come in on the side and move up from the side and then out through the top. And of course, Kayleigh's already mentioned, of course, the ammonia is heavy, it's a little differently, but if we get a little bit of air movement, if we get cold and we get a wind, then we close those slats and can keep it from getting too cold if we got newborns in there. So what's our next slide? I think we're close to the end. Yeah, I think we're about ready to wrap it up. I've been talking a lot, so I don't know how many people have given up on us, but we appreciate you hanging in there. We'll be glad to take questions. We do have a short video that I just kind of threw at Corey here at the last minute. It's about 7.5 minutes that I think really nicely conveys some concepts. But let's maybe address some questions. Corey, we're going to let you, as our moderator, kind of judge where folks are and what people most want to hear and talk about.
Hey, Tom. Basically, we've had some discussions about some of the content of which y'all been talking about. What do you think about mats over top of concrete, and how they might reduce some of that chill factor or moisture or things like that? But then you also need to consider, or they want to know about your considerations for things like harboring insects or rodents, or encouraging them to come, or things even like, if you don't clean them well enough, harboring diseases.
Yeah, those are all excellent points. Back on the mats over top of concrete, I don't know the answer. That would make sense to me that the mat, of course, has a degree of porosity, so it makes sense to me that it would provide some insulation. But I don't think I'm qualified to answer the question. I think those are all really particularly specifically about using mats over top of concrete. I alluded to in the slides, I didn't talk about it. I have some sheep friends that they have horses, and so they're working with a horse barn that has a good bit of concrete in it. A lot of times it's horse stalls on both sides and in the center aisle. And I've seen them using mats, and certainly in terms of being able to clean out, that's it seems to work well for them. As far as that temperature effect, it would make sense the mats are good, but frankly, I don't know that I'm qualified or know enough to comment. Corey, or Corey or Kayleigh or anybody else has particular experience. I'm open to, what others might share.
I don't have experience with mats on concrete.
I would certainly think it would help. I think it would help,
Yeah,
as opposed to just the raw concrete.
I think it would as well. Yes, I agree.
Regarding, the accumulation, of pests and vermin, you might say, in a barn. I think that there you get into a whole realm of, things we need to integrate together. First off is proper drainage to make sure that barn has an opportunity to dry out. And if we're using it for winter lambing, certainly, the kind of the pestilence that can accumulate, that isn't as much a concern, because usually in the mid-Atlantic, at least, we've got periods of freezing. But but that's where I'm kind of thinking off the top of my head here. I'm thinking of my own barn that has a dirt floor. It's an old structure, that where I think I have a problem with that, with manure accumulation and potential disease issue. It's more often is associated with if it's not properly drained. So making sure that we've got good drainage and it's not staying wet. I'm just personally in this stage, I'm hustling to get the barn cleaned out and getting back down to the clay floor. I have not cleaned my barn in several years. I did have some pneumonia problems in my baby lambs last year, and I attribute that to not having gotten my barn cleaned out properly. And that's why I'm hustling up to get that stripped down to the bare clay, and so I can start with fresh straw this year to alleviate some of those problems. So, the folks that brought that up, you bring up a good point. And I think it's as far as really alleviating it, I would associate with moisture, that if we've got that proper barn design that is drying out, and it's got an opportunity during the season to dry out, that's going to do us more good than anything else to alleviate some of those disease transmission issues. But I think we'll learn in the health modules that particularly parasites, they are incredibly resilient bugs that can survive for long periods of time. So it's really hard to just completely sanitize, particularly an old pre-existing wooden structure.
Yeah, and I would agree with you, Tom, from the standpoint of I guess fortunately or unfortunately had experience with both dirt floors, concrete floors, and mats, all kinds of things on a couple of different structures. When we went back and repurposed old dairy barn. So we had some different things available to us. And to me, they all work. It just depends on the situation in which you're trying to use them. And you have to look at each one and kind of go, well, let's see how we're going to maintain what we're going to put in there. As long as the concrete has a good slope to it and it drains well and has a place for that water or moisture to go, and you use a rubber mat to cover it and you clean it periodically, works great. Dirt floors, if they're sloped and they run and the moisture doesn't accumulate, work great. I prefer, in my perfect world, I would prefer a dirt base, because you're going to get some of that warmth. Use some gravel on top of that and some bluestone on top of that, and then put bedding on top of it to your preference. And the reason why I like that is because you can put bedding on top, and then the bluestone and the gravel allows the moisture to drain away and absorb back into the ground. So it's really what your own situation calls for and what you have.
Hey, Corey, I made a face. You mentioned the bluestone, and generally, yeah, it's good. sometimes that bluestone will show up at the bottom of the fleece. And so clippers and sheep shearers, they don't meet up too good when you get that bluestone dust down in the fleece. But if you got shorn ewes, or they got full fleeces, it's not a huge issue. But in the belly, shearing off that belly, sometimes you'll encounter some of that bluestone, right when you're first shearing them, if they were in the barn lambing, and then later on that stone dust will show up and mess up your clippers. So
Well, I agree with you. That's why it's imperative to have another bedding on top.
yeah.
Deep to do that. One thing somebody suggested was maybe if there are any participants out there that want to share how their housing and pens are set up for various groups, what they're, not to take a long time going over them, but is there anybody that finds anything very effective for their region or their weather environment and the number of sheep they have? Would like to share that.
Could I?
We've got a few things going on in the chat. Maybe they just like to do it that way.
We have it was originally a kids playhouse, but the flooring is actually deck material. I find that works out nice, that it's built on 4x4s, and we raise it up off the ground with patio blocks. So it's completely off the ground because we're built on the side of a hill. So everything in our yard and our area has extreme moisture issues. So the worst we have to worry about is the 4x4s rotting away. Replace that every 10 or so years, I'm going to guess, because we haven't actually had it. We've probably had it for 8 years now, and it's held up fairly nicely. But that decking material, we've torn up one board with a pointed shovel, so we got to use a flat shovel, but it works nicely.
Hey, Corey,
Yes.
this is Jim. And we haven't talked about essentially the plastic shelters, essentially the dairy shelters, calf shelters, and the pros and cons of those. I'll just share experience having built shelters intended to be pulled behind a tractor. They're very durable, but they're very, very heavy. And by the time you get done paying for all the lumber, they can be very expensive as well. And for the same price, you can get the calf shelter, the calf hutches is what I'm trying to say. And they work very well in the very cold weather. Put straw down in the bottom, and so it provides that insulation. I guess the thing to watch for is significant windstorms. They can be picked up and moved by the wind if it's really, really strong. Yet that's also an advantage. An individual person can move the round one, set it up on its side and roll it. And get inside the rectangular ones, you might look like a turtle going across the pasture, but a person can hoist it up on their shoulders and move it along. So there's something to be said for the calf hutches and their practicality for small numbers of animals out in a pasture.
Yeah, Jim, those are fiberglass generally, right?
I don't think they're fiberglass. Well, I imagine there's both. The ones that we have here, I don't know, some sort of a plastic material. I don't think that it's fiberglass, but it doesn't shatter like fiberglass.
Okay. All right.
Something
And
that's
have you acquired used ones, or did you buy them new?
Both. And
I don't want to put you on the spot. What do they run?
Last time we purchased one was 3 or 4 years ago. I think paid $250, maybe
Okay.
$280 for a rectangular one. And that was at one of the co-ops. And I spent that much for wood in making the ones that I could pull with the tractor. And yeah, they work fine.
The only two issues that I have with those that I've heard about and seen, both deal with their usability and serviceability year round and in the location in which you may live in. And just because they can get very hot in the summertime if they
Yeah,
don't
that's
have
right.
ventilation. And they can also hold a lot of moisture in the summertime if they don't have good ventilation. So if you're going to use those, you want to make sure that you don't have too high a stocking rate with them, having too many head of animals in there. And then you might want to retrofit some openings in the back of them. Most of them will have one where you can feed out of it or let it, the door open or down, up and down. But you might want to put a couple more in it that you might want to use from time to time. But in the wintertime, in most locations, you get that warmth from the sun and photos, the photo period and all that. So they work pretty well, but you have to be careful with them. And then older ones were made out of fiberglass material. Now they have a plastic molded material that they moved to. They both work, but the newer ones are lighter. So the putting them on skids or fastening them down it's much more critical because a good wind can take them a long way. And if you have other animals out there like horses or cows or anything like that, and you have a hutch blowing through the field, you might have your livestock go all over the place or injure themselves.
Makes for an interesting night.
Yeah.
Corey, Rod DeArmond, for lambing jugs, I've used wire panels that I've attached to 2x4s, and the 2x4s have I attach with bolts to the walls, and so they swing on those bolts. Or the Premier one has those screwy wires that go down that also allow it to open and close. And then I just clip them closed when the sheep are in there. But if I need to clean it out, I just pull it open and clean it out. And that's worked very well. And at the end of the season, I take all of that out to thoroughly clean it. And I use rubber mats. And when I clean the rubber, when I shovel it out, I always spray it down with a disinfectant, a Clorox, and let it dry, and then rebed it.
Big time.
Yeah, that's a good quick comment. I appreciate you sharing that. That's a good comment because I have seen those lambing jugs that use the wire panels, and those, what I've seen, a really nice system. That lightweight, so it's really easy to stow them away. And yes, I think you make some good points. Well, one little minor thing is there's always trade-offs. Sometimes those metal panels, depending on the source and where you get them, is they can have sharp edges and they catch your clothes and get your skin. So that can be one of the drawbacks, but they are, in terms of visibility, lightweight, offer a lot of flexibility. Yeah, I'm glad you mentioned that. Something I've neglected to bring up was those fairly closed mesh wire panels that's a good tool, especially for the lambing jugs.
How do y'all feel about sanitizing areas in barns or that are underneath cover? When you clean them out, there's been a couple of different things brought up. Everything from Clorox to dry lime to possibly something like a Novosan or a astringent of some kind. Giving recommendations for that work well in the barn?
I know that I know Novosan's expensive, and I guess I don't know. I'm really qualified. I wouldn't feel comfortable necessarily saying definitively that particularly looking at pre-existing, wooden structures. If we necessarily are going to achieve that much with using an expensive disinfectant like Nalvasan. Now, I mentioned, I saw someone mention using pulverized lime, agricultural lime. And I've done that, and that's not expensive, and particularly for cleaning up a wet spot can be. And if we're moving sheep in, and we know we're going to move sheep back in there pretty quick, throwing some lime down, it's a really good. I would concur with that. A good idea. I guess my sense is that as a shepherd, the best thing we could do is is making sure that facility can dry out and we can get it dried out. But as far as using a disinfectant, boy, I guess I'd talk to my veterinarian. Corey, you might have talked to some of the veterinarians that has some more particular recommendations, but that can get pretty expensive, particularly using a product like Nalvasan. And I'm not sure, particularly looking at wooden surfaces, if we're going to accomplish that much more than just getting that manure hauled out of there and giving it the opportunity to dry out.
Hey, Tom,
Yes.
on the disinfectant, many of those disinfectants are neutralized as soon as they hit organic matter, like wood or dirt. So disinfecting a barn or something like that is kind of it's good money after bad in some respects. They
Yeah.
probably make something for that exact type of setting, but I'm sure it's pricey. It's probably just as good to get it, as like you said, cleaned out as much as you can, let it dry out, and put down some lime to neutralize any ammonia.
No,
that kind of-
well, thank you for that. In terms of how those work. Yeah.
It's the same thing with Clorox. As soon as it hits organic matter, soil, wood, anything like that, it drops in efficacy so fast because it's neutralized, it's not funny. So yeah, there are products out there that work very effectively, but it depends on how deep your pockets are, how much you want to invest. But lime, I like it from my perspective. It works really well. It helps dry things up. It changes the pH a little bit. It does neutralize ammonia and lots of things like that. I don't talk about going in and coating the place with it heavily, but make sure you get a nice light coat around that. It's going to have some bedding on top before you let young lambs and goats and things like that in, because it can also be troublesome to bare skin if they get too much in contact with it, but it does work well.
What's your all thoughts about bleach?
Bleach is Clorox, or it's going to be one of those products that it's effective until you apply it to organic matter. And when it becomes in contact with manure, dirt, things like that, it basically gets neutralized. So it has a very limited effectiveness in most barn settings. It can work pretty well on concrete that's kept clean, but just for short periods. There's somebody else here that said they use steam clean. They have an old wood barn and they use that. That would work well if you had the time and the capability to do it and to let it dry out. But that's another one of those niche things. If you got it, that works great, but it may be hard to do it in some cases, but it's another option. Tom, you want to show that video?
Yeah, I would, if for those of, I've got a video here. It's about 8 minutes. Janet McNally, a lady that I've met, she's out in Minnesota. And if Corey can pull that up, and if you're interested, I think it does a lot illustrates some concepts and principles of sheep handling areas. It's not too long. It's also, you'll see it's not a super fancy setup. She also talks a little bit about a mothering crate, and I think that I think in some of the other modules, I think they'll go into more of that with that lambing management. But yeah, Corey, if we got time for those interested in sticking around another 8 minutes, I think it's a neat video worth looking at.
Hopefully we get it up.
I think when you share a screen, you've got to tell it to synchronize the audio. I believe there's an audio sync option when you go to share the screen. I can't remember where that is. I know we got some Zoom experts on here that know exactly what to do, but how you get your audio to come through the Zoom when you share your screen. Sorry, I can't be more help to you.
There's a button before you share the screen, there's a button down below that says that prompts you to share the audio.
Share audio, yeah.
I'm not seeing that.
Well, I'm sorry, I can't help you. We don't mean to hold folks up.
Hold on.
There you go.
Having a good handling facility
There you go.
goes a long ways to making your job of keeping sheep a lot more pleasant. Not only does it save you time, but it's going to save you a lot of frustration. Hi, I'm Janet McNally. I'm owner of Tamarack Lamb and Wool, and I'm going to share with you some of the things that I've incorporated into my facility that have improved the flow of sheep through the system and made it much easier to work with sheep. Some of the features I've included in my system include making the entrance to the system inviting. I do this by using welded wire panels they can see through. This makes them feel a lot more willing to go into the system, and it doesn't feel so much like a trap.
Another point here worth noting is the sheep entering the handling system on the right can see sheep already in the holding pen on the left. Again, this comforts the livestock and will help them feel more comfortable in this new environment.
Next, they go up a dual lead-up chute. This is a double-wide chute that has panels down the middle that they can see through. Sheep are much more willing to go into your chute system if they have a buddy right beside them. Then it funnels down to a single file chute. This is where the work is done. I have my scale in the middle of the chute rather than at the end so that the sheep can see sheep up ahead and are more willing to walk into the scale and will be calmer once they're inside. I've also included a lot of gates for people. Nothing will wear you out more than having to climb over fences all day. My system is designed to wrap around me. There's a couple of reasons for this. One is that the sheep are more willing to travel around a person in a circle. The other reason, though, is like a well-designed kitchen. It takes fewer steps to walk from one end to the other if it's built like a circle. Here is an aerial view of the system. Notice on the right-hand side we have a large round pen. This is the catch pen, or the first place that the sheep enter the system. You'll see that we have a number of different ways to enter the system. At the top are two 8-foot gates making a 16-foot opening. On the bottom left we have a 12-foot gate. At the very bottom we have an 8-foot gate. That way we can enter from any direction that we need to. The sheep enter the system by the gate at the bottom. That's the crowding pen that they go into first. If we have a lot of sheep, we put them into the holding pen to the left. From the holding pen, the sheep travel back towards the direction that they just came from. This really helps encourage the sheep to move. Sheep are much easier to move back towards where they came from than it is to move them in a direction away from where they just came from. This is the catch pen. As you can see, they can see right through. It's made up of these welded wire panels that are 4x4 square. I also have some 2x4 square panels. All our gates are see-through, so the sheep are always facing in the direction that you need them to go. If you have a solid gate, they may not be looking at that as an escape route, and it can be very hard to get them to turn around and look at it. Even the beginning of our dual lead-up chute is open so that they can see out. This encourages the sheep to move into the system. You can see that the sheep move very easily into the system. These lambs have probably been in here 4 or 5 times. Last time they were in here was 6 weeks ago, and this is actually the first run. So they have not had any practice. Let's look at that from the back. You can see that our dual lead-up chute is made by taking 2 U-brackets for a single file chute and just simply tying them together and then putting see-through gates up the middle of the system. The detail about our dual lead-up chute is that there must be a gate up in the front. This is a sorting gate that's been installed backwards, and the whole purpose of this gate is to prevent sheep from going up one side, making a U-turn at the top, and going back down the other side, thus clogging up the whole system. You could put a spring on this gate so that it's in a more neutral position, and then you wouldn't have to come over and manually move it back and forth. Here is the single file working chute. We use this chute for drenching or deworming, ear tagging, weighing, sorting, scanning, hoof trimming, and shearing. I'm demonstrating the use of the sorting gate here. And once that side is done, we can flip the gate and let the other side in. The gates at the front and the back of the system are what are called bifold gates. I find these very quick and easy to use. Isn't it nice when you load your chute system that you don't have to really make any effort to get the sheep up to the front of it, that they will just readily go up there? Having a good border collie is always helpful too. When the sheep stall, I just simply start to walk past them and that gets them moving. As I mentioned, my scale is located in the middle of my handling system. Here is a sheep's eye view of the scale. Sheep standing in front of the scale will encourage the sheep behind the scale to enter the scale, and they'll be a lot more calmer during weighing. I also have a stand for holding the shearing machine so we can crutch in the chute system. There's a gate there right in front of the scale so I can get in behind the sheep. And we also do our shearing here. Something I haven't mentioned is this cattle chute. This is a Palco cattle crate, and it's a lot cheaper than a for-purpose made sheep handling crate. What I do in here is I tattoo, I trim feet, especially on large rams. I use this as a foster gate during lambing. It has a 4-inch neck opening, which is just perfect for sheep. Not all cattle chutes close down to 4 inches, so you do have to check that out. I hope this video has given you some ideas that you can incorporate into your handling system to make your life easier with sheep. Bye for now.
Thanks, Corey, for making that possible. I saw that video. I think she just very concisely summarized, some really good concepts to apply, and in terms of sheep visibility and handling. And you might note, from Kayleigh's presentation, talking about that flight zone where they stall in the raceway, and she can just move past them, get past that balance point, past their shoulder, a little bit behind them, and get them moving again. So Corey, thanks for making that possible. It worked out.
No problem, Tom. We've gone on past our time by quite a bit, and I'm not going to really ask anybody to stay on a whole lot longer. If you have any burning questions, shout them out now, or hold them until 6 to 6:30 of next week. We can try to talk about them.
Hey, Corey.
Yeah.
I'm sorry. I missed out on the very beginning of the seminar. I was still outside doing chores. Did you ever get the website page working? Or the web,
Sort of. You'll hopefully you'll get a letter or a note from me on Thursday or Friday that explains kind of what happened. As I explained earlier in the program, basically some people were able to see it, some people were not. The Google IT folks said that they're not sure why that was that way, but that I should make a Google group and put everybody in it for sharing capacity and be able to make that happen. And that's great. And we were going to work on that. But problem is, after the initial day of putting in numbers, I can only put in 125 the first day and then 25 each day in succession. We have over 400 people on the sign up list at this point, and it'll probably be Wednesday or Thursday before I get everybody entered into the group. But as soon as that happens, everybody should have access to it and should be getting a letter from me that spells some of that out.
okay, great. Thank you.
As soon as possible, I'll say that. I probably should cut off registration, but I'm still getting notes from people going, I just heard about this. Can I come do this or can I come do that? Since you're all saving the recordings, I can do it without missing anything. And I figure once you get over 400, why not? I mean,
yeah,
you know, it's vastly more than we anticipated when we floated this idea around. I just hope that everybody's getting something out of it. And we want to make that as easy as possible. And that resource page will hopefully do that.
great. Thank you.
Sure. Want to thank all of you for hanging out. Those of you that are still here, really appreciate it. Hopefully you're getting some out of it. Want to thank Tom and Kayleigh for the great presentation this evening, and everybody that's been on the chat interacting and putting information. It's all great. I know I appreciate it, and I think everybody else does too. So thank all of you.
Thank you all for joining us.
We'll see you next.
Thank you.
Thank you for your time and patience.